Good morning and thank you for coming. My name is Asim Siddiqui and I'm the president of the Pakistani Student Association. The Pakistani Conference was an initiative that the Pakistani Student Association started in 2010 to promote the study of Pakistan at the University of Michigan and to contribute to critical examination of thematic issues pertinent to Pakistan to support the work of academics and students studying the region and finally to create a forum for discussion. To create a forum for discussion between academics, practitioners, faculty, students, and members of the wider Michigan community on key thematic subjects. In the 2010 and 2012 conference, we were joined amongst others by Mr. Akbar S. Zaidi, Mr. Zahid Hussain, Ambassador Howard Schaefer, Hank Kennedy, Professor Juan Cole, and a number of young Pakistani academics working on issues ranging from conflict resolution for prevention of sectarian violence to institutional strengthening. This year, we wanted to focus on and begin our examination of broader themes, economic rights and international law in relation to drones. We hope to look at prospects for human rights in the light of the historic democratic transition next month. This year, we are supported by the Center of South Asian Studies, and for the first panel, I would like to introduce Professor Farina Mir, who is the Director of South Asian Studies and a Professor of History at U of M.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Asim has just introduced me. I'm Farina Mir. I'm the director of the Center for South Asian Studies. And it really is our pleasure to co-host with the Pakistan Students Association today's conference. I wanted to take a few minutes before introducing our speakers for some thank yous. I first actually want to thank all of the people who are attending the conference today and speaking to you. These are all folks with amazingly hectic schedules, and although I had to engage in some arm twisting on occasion, it was really very, very limited. They've been amazingly generous in making time for all of us to come to Ann Arbor and speak to us about their work and the issues at hand. I want to thank our support at the center who have really made today's logistics, have had a serious hand in making the logistics arrangements for today, and that would be Zilka Joseph and Sandy Schultz. Thank you both for all of your arrangements today. And I want to take an opportunity to thank the American Institute of Pakistan Studies, which is only one of the many bodies that is supporting today's conference, but they were very happy to be involved, and we thank them for their support, along with a plethora of institutions at U of M who have provided the financial support for today. And lastly, I actually wanted to thank the number of students in the Pakistan Students Association who have helped make today possible. In addition to Asim, who just spoke to you, I'd like to thank Zain Khan, Alina Alam, Imad Ansari, Sharik Bashir, and Musa Raza. Really, it's their hard work that is making everything possible, and it's a real testament to their commitment to Pakistan that they do all of this, and that this is the third Michigan-Pakistan Conference. Without further ado, our two speakers today are Professor Mariam Mufti and Professor Saadia Toor. I'd like to introduce both of them right now, and then they will speak to you. Professor Mariam Mufti did her BSc at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, known to all of us as LUMS, in the social sciences with a minor in economics. She then went on to do both an MA and a PhD at Johns Hopkins University in political science, where she studied where she really was trained as a comparativist, though obviously with a strong focus on Pakistan. Her work on elite recruitment and regime dynamics in Pakistan is really the focus of her work is on how recruitment and selection of the political elite explains regime dynamics in Pakistan, and today she's going to be talking to us actually a little bit about that, but give us some insights on the political process. Our second speaker after Professor Mufti will be Professor Saadia Toor. Professor Toor was trained at Cornell University, where she did her PhD in development sociology. She now teaches at the College of Staten Island at CUNY in New York, where she is an associate professor. Some of us had the pleasure of reading her book, The State of Islam, Culture and Cold War Politics, last semester. I recommend it to all of you highly. It's a great read. And Professor Toor is currently, or at least planning in the future, to do some more work on the Progressive Writers Association. And today she too will be engaging, of course, the broad theme of the first panel, which is politics and human rights in Pakistan. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mufti.
All right, good morning. Let me start first by thanking the organizers of this conference, and in particular Farina Amir, for inviting me to participate in today's event. I was given the unenviable, I might add, task of defining to what extent the upcoming election represents a democratic transition that will allow for an increased space for human rights discourse to emerge in Pakistan. And my initial reaction, based on the numerous human rights violations over the past 5 years of the PPP government, is that while an election in less than 40 days is almost certainly a step in the right direction, it does not signify the crossing of a democratic threshold that goes beyond a competitive election while also protecting the political and civil rights of the citizens. But upon further examination and thinking further about this subject, this intuitive response requires further nuance and explanation, and I hope that that is what my presentation will accomplish today. I will try to answer two questions and tie them together by way of a conclusion. The first is, does the transfer of power from a civilian-elected government to another after the completion of a full 5-year term imply that the rules of the game have changed? And second, are there any indications that with this onset of a democratic transition, that Pakistan's political system is in fact maturing and moving towards establishing democratic norms favorable to the protection of human rights? If so, then what are some of the long-standing systemic issues that are yet to be addressed? Pakistan is at a crossroads in its history. For the first time in 66 years of its existence, a civilian elected government will transfer power to another elected government after completing a full 5-year term in parliament. And this is highly significant, certainly. But not just this. A presidential election is due to be held later this year. Come October 2013, a new chief of army staff will have to be appointed. Come December 2013, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is going to reach a mandatory retirement age, which certainly implies that Pakistan's most powerful institutions are going to be facing a massive leadership change this year. This upcoming election is also momentous in other ways as well. For instance, political parties have been extended the privilege to campaign and contest elections in FATA, where previously non-party elections have been held. It is also the first time that 37.4 million women are registered to vote in the polls as per NADRA's statistics, a new dawn in the era of increased female participation. This is indeed an important turning point in Pakistan's circuitous attempts at transitioning to a democracy. An election, however, still cannot be taken for granted in a country where there is a long history of military intervention and electoral rigging. It will be messy, but I have to reiterate that it has to happen. The question really is, have the rules of the game changed? Has democracy become the only game in town? And the simple answer to this is no. A procedurally minimum definition of democracy includes 4 key attributes. Number 1, regular elections that are competitive, free, and fair. Number 2, full adult suffrage. On these 2 points, to a certain extent, yes, Pakistan has made long strides. To a large extent, yes, the election is reasonably competitive, although the legitimacy of said competition can be called into question, given the numerous examples of electoral rigging that we hear of. and of course harassment of opposition party workers during elections. Points 3 and 4, broad protection of civil rights, including freedom of speech, press, and association. This in Pakistan is inherently limited, and we are all aware of how, even though there have been attempts at an independent media that is outspoken, there have been bans on the internet, there have been bans on websites that are talking about Balochi separatism and have blasphemous content that is deemed to be blasphemous. The fourth point, the absence of a non-elected tutelary authority, such as a military or religious bodies that limit elected officials' ability to govern. And as we are all aware, the military still retains control over certain aspects of policy making in Pakistan, most notably in foreign policy. So a plethora of terms have emerged trying to describe this politics of hybridity that we see in Pakistan. For example, scholars, political scientists such as Lucan Way and Stephen Levitsky call it competitive authoritarianism. Andreas Schedler referred to this as electoral authoritarianism. Suffice to say, why not just refer to Pakistan as a hybrid regime where there is a combination of both authoritarian and democratic tendencies that tend to fluctuate? And this, of course, is in line with the ranking that Pakistan has received from the Freedom House survey. On average, Pakistan has scored 4.9, which falls in the category of partly free regime. And this is taking into account that there was an election held in 2008, and there is going to be one taking place in 2013. So I would argue that this hybrid state in Pakistan is dynamic, where this combination of authoritarian and democratic tendencies keeps fluctuating. Now, presently, with the upcoming election in 2013, Pakistan appears to be erring on the side of more democratic practice. Okay, so this is another shift in this combination of hybridity that I am talking about. Okay, scholars like O'Donnell and Schmitter, scholars of democratic transitions literature, would claim that this is in fact a founding election, and we seem to mistake very often what a founding election really is. The founding election is only the start of a process. It is not the culmination or the institutionalization of the democratic process. And this is something that we tend to forget in our optimism about the upcoming 2013 election. And so it most certainly does not mean that democracy has become the only game in town in Pakistan. Now, this, of course, has consequences for the way political parties participate in the electoral process. And here we need to take into account two aspects. Okay, the first is, how do political parties in Pakistan organize and function? Okay, and the second is, how do political parties strategize to win an election? So let me start with the first question. How do political parties in Pakistan organize and function? And some of my conclusions are not going to come as a surprise to those of you who have been following Pakistan's politics very, very closely. But some of the findings that I'm presenting over here today are based on a year-long fieldwork that I carried out in Pakistan in 2008, right after the 2008 election, to essentially assess how political parties make decisions, how do they organize, all right, and how do they function, and whether or not that actually has a bearing on the way they strategize for elections, all right? And that is some of the work that I'm presenting right now. Now, Pakistan's party system is weakly institutionalized for all intents and purposes. And a description of party organization in the catch-all parties of Pakistan, for example, the PPP, the PMLN, PMLQ, and now the PTI, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, underscores the weakness of these parties as organizations and the autonomy individual politicians exercise through their parties. An overarching theme of this weakness is the lack of party discipline, which is not typically manifested in legislative voting, but is rampant, but is manifested in the rampant party switching and tendency of political parties to factionalize. The organizational apparatus of parties is fragile and ineffectual. Central and local party organs rarely meet. They are under-resourced, to the extent that party offices in many parts of Pakistan are not even opened up, even though political parties claim that they have party organizations and local party organizations across the country, because they're making a claim to national representation. Okay, this local party organization is in fact not even professionalized. Okay, and it only comes into being when an electoral process is about to occur. All right. As expected then, decision-making is centralized in the office of party presidents and their close associates, who are very often family members. Finally, parties in Pakistan have limited resources and therefore sponsor few extra electoral activities. All right. Now, what does this explain? This weak institutionalization explain? What it explains is the lack of investment in expanding and strengthening the party's membership base. All right. Now, this has a bearing on candidate selection, which is a process that all political parties have to carry out prior to an electoral process. Okay, after all, you need to have candidates contesting on your party ticket. All right. So who are you going to select as a candidate, given that your party organizations are extremely weak and you haven't necessarily reached out to the people locally? All right. Political parties in Pakistan operate primarily as lasting coalitions that field candidates for legislative and executive offices and therefore see themselves as aggregate of potential winners and not aggregates of potential interests. The pattern of political competition that has evolved among the political parties is heavily invested in stimulating the mobilization of constituencies by offering direct material incentives and symbolic advantages to those who support party candidates. Clientelism in politics has led to non-programmatic parties dependent on charismatic leaders to capture the hearts and minds of the voters. PPP, the Pakistan People's Party, the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, and the Pakistan Muslim League Qaid, led by the Chaudhry brothers, are catch-all parties. And they claim to be nationally representative of Pakistan's people, which means that they would like to contest in constituencies all over Pakistan. However, I just pointed out that their local party organizations are not strong, which means that they do not have a party vote in many of the constituencies where they are going to be contesting elections. So to keep this image alive, they tend to rely on local charismatic leaders to sustain the party's position instead of investing resources in a permanent organizational apparatus at the local level. These politicians that are selected invest their own resources, time, capital, personnel, to deliver the message of the political party to the constituent in exchange for the party ticket and access to public office. The relationship between the politician and central party can vary enormously depending on how influential and indispensable the candidate makes himself to the political party. Now, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, which, although not a new entrant to politics in Pakistan, is definitely a political party that is adopting the same strategy of candidate selection as the Pakistan People's Party and the Pakistan Muslim League. All right. In this sense, political parties, the larger mainstream political parties that I've just mentioned, are akin to franchise organizations, with the politicians operating autonomously and unhindered in their own constituencies. The party is dependent on this politician to advertise the party label, thereby increasing party identification instead of the politician being dependent on the right party ticket to win the election. Since the party does not finance the campaign either, politicians are beholden to their constituents and their own resources for re-election and can therefore operate as autonomous entrepreneurs and switch to another franchise or party, evincing limited loyalty and without incurring significant costs. As a result of this dynamic, PPP and PML are incohesive party organizations. Now, some of you can very well turn around and argue with me, but PPP is contesting safe seats in Sindh, and PMLN is contesting safe seats in Lahore, okay? And in these places, yes, the party vote counts considerably, and they can actually put up candidates who are not necessarily these constituency politicians as I'm describing them, okay? But this is only in their geographic strongholds and is not exactly the bulk of the seats that they're going to win in parliament. The bulk of the seats that these political parties are in fact contesting are competitive seats, where there is a minor party vote for the Pakistan People's Party, the party vote of the Pakistan Muslim League, all right, and the party vote of the PTI to a certain extent as well now, all right. So in this case, when you want to choose a candidate, the candidate that you select is going to be an individual who can mobilize his own personal clout, all right, in order to add to the party vote and therefore win the election for the political party, okay. As a result, explaining this dependence on these so-called candidates that I'm calling constituency politicians. Now, in contrast to these larger catch-all political parties, you have parties like MQM and ANP, all right? Now, these are political parties which have not factionalized, okay? The factionalization of the MQM that occurred in the 1990s was an artificial factionalization that was manipulated by Pakistan's intelligence agencies and the army, as we have come to find out. All right, these are relatively more cohesive than the larger political parties. Now, while this may be a function of their smaller size, it could also be more. It could also be because of the different strategies that they mobilize to appeal to party supporters. For example, in MQM, the personality cult that surrounds Altaf Hussain has led to the development of an even more centralized organization than the kind that you see in PPP and PMLN, which is practically manifested in a hierarchical and disciplined internal structure. Another reason for the stronger party cohesion is exactly this thesis of candidate selection, where MQM and ANP are in fact contesting safe seats in geographical strongholds. All right. As a result, all right, party vote within these safe seats or these safe constituencies is very, very high. All right. So the candidates they select are party members who can mobilize this party vote. Okay, they're not necessarily mobilizing their own personal vote to win the election in the constituencies that MQM and ANP are contesting. Last thing to mention is that political parties are under-resourced. And a major criteria for the selection of candidates is their ability to finance their own election campaigns. Okay, now MQM and Jamaat-e-Islami are the only two political parties that are an exception to this rule, because these two political parties do in fact finance the electoral campaigns of their candidates. All right, but here's where it becomes even more interesting. All right, in order to become a candidate of any of the political parties, the other political parties that I've been talking about, you have to apply for the party ticket. All right, that application for the party ticket comes along with a ticket application fee. All right. For example, the Pakistan People's Party has formally invited applications for party tickets in February, asking candidates to deposit a fee of Rs 40,000 if they want to contest a National Assembly seat, Rs 30,000 for a Provincial Assembly seat. Now, these are numbers that the political party is providing themselves. There is also talk in newspapers and in our independent media that these political parties are charging a lot more than just 40,000 and 30,000, but more exorbitant sums of money from their candidates. Similarly, Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz has charged 50,000 for the National Assembly seat. All right. Now, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, which has also jumped on the bandwagon, also because it's under-resourced, is slightly more interesting because along with the to apply for the ticket application, if you're below the age of 35, you have to pay only 10,000. But if you're over the age of 35, then yes, you're paying the same 50,000 or 30,000 that the other parties are charging. All right. Now, why is this interesting? All right. This is interesting because this is one way that political parties make money. All right. And fund their own central party electoral campaign. All right. It is also interesting because it is marginalizing, to a large extent, those party members who have devoted a lot of their time to their political parties but cannot actually afford to contest election. All right? Right from the get-go, you are prioritizing those who have the money to become candidates in Pakistan. All right? Right from the get-go, you have marginalized a significant chunk of your population. All right? So in terms of being a democratic process, demographic representation is not necessarily being upheld. All right. Now, the first past the post electoral system in Pakistan and parliamentary politics in Pakistan would encourage political parties to calculate electoral success in terms of the number of seats they can win in the national and provincial assemblies. Okay. Now, this would imply that political parties would intuitively think that we should probably field as many candidates in as many constituencies as possible, and that these candidates should have the characteristics that I've already mentioned in the previous section. But that is not necessarily the case. Because another thing that is beginning to happen in Pakistan, well, it's not beginning to happen in Pakistan, but has happened a lot, at least before this particular election, is the formation of electoral alliances. All right. Now, what is interesting, if you examine some of the electoral alliances that have been made in the past few months, is that they're purely motivated by the need to undercut opponents and build on existing strengths to increase the likelihood of winning the election. And now that's perfectly fine. All right. Political parties want to win the election, and that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to undercut their opponents. All right. The problem is that political parties are overlooking ideological affinities. All right. And some of you might argue that, well, big deal, because these political parties, as it is, are non-programmatic and are clientelist in nature. But you have to remember that because you're overlooking ideological affinities, you're choosing allies in politically expedient ways that are keeping in mind only short-term and parochial interests. The short-term interest being to win the election. Well, once you win the election, what's going to happen when you try to form the government? That's a whole different dynamic altogether. All right? So that's where it becomes problematic. The lack of ideological affinity also becomes problematic when you have political parties necessarily viewing themselves as aggregates of winning candidates and not necessarily as aggregates of potential interests, and not having a well-defined policy agenda at all. So when you pose the question to me about the increased space for a human rights discourse, okay, that human rights discourse is really not what's going to determine how these political parties are going to strategize to win the election. All right? Forget human rights. Other policies are not necessarily going to come into the picture either. All right? Another aspect of this election campaign is very often to differentiate yourself from your opponent. The way you do that is by issuing a manifesto. All right? Who reads this manifesto? And how widely is it disseminated anyway? All right? You also have to remember that the manifestos that political parties have actually churned out right before this particular election, on average, are 30 to 40 pages long. They are lengthy and they are verbose. All right? And your voters do not have the time to go through these documents. Okay? Why are they lengthy and why are they verbose? Because they're bucket lists of all the problems that Pakistan faces, all right, with absolutely no prioritization of how these problems need to be addressed, okay? So a coherent plan of action is not there, okay? Another complaint that civil society organizations have made is that, well, our voices are not manifested in these manifestos, okay? Our voices are not heard through these manifestos. What we want is not what these political parties are talking about. If you interview the political parties, the political party politicians will say, well, actually, we had consultations with civil society groups. All right. So, for example, Ehsan Iqbal of the Pakistan Muslim League N will say that I had a very long extended meeting with Anis Haroon of the Aurat Foundation, and she explained to me that this is exactly how we should approach the women's rights issue. Well, that's perfectly fine. All right. But identifying that women's rights are a problem in Pakistan is not enough. All right. What is also needed is a plan for action and how these political parties are actually going to achieve that. All right. All political parties in Pakistan recognize that women's rights are an issue. All political parties in Pakistan also emphasize that extrajudicial killings and missing persons are an issue, and all such human rights violations. All right. Whether or not these political parties have actually given any thought to how they're going to sort out these problems or how they're actually going to try and fix the problems of implementation in Pakistan is not mentioned at all, okay? Now, I'm not saying that the manifesto has to do everything, okay? But at the very least, the manifesto should differentiate one political party from another, all right? Which is not exactly happening through the manifestos that are issued. The point of this very, very lengthy discussion of how political parties, in fact, strategize to win an election was to basically say that this election, in terms of how the political parties are going to try to win, is no different from the ones that have preceded previously. All right. The rules haven't changed as yet. All right. Some of these rules are changing. All right. In the sense that we suddenly have a very overactive Election Commission of Pakistan that is helping the electorate weed out candidates by deeming who is deserving of an election nomination. Is that what Pakistan needs right now? Certainly not, okay? What Pakistan does, however, need is an uninterrupted electoral process, all right? An uninterrupted electoral process that will, over time, develop the requisite practices for legitimate elections, all right? And in the question-answer session, there are ways that we can talk about as to how this uninterrupted electoral process would actually help. Now, in this present situation, then, by means of a wrap-up, I just want to talk a little bit about the fact. I want to talk a little bit about whether in this particular present situation there is room for a human rights discourse, all right? And has an increased space developed for a human rights discourse? Now, this is a discussion that gets swept under the rug, and it is to your credit that you're holding a conference that will speak to this particular issue. Several strides have been made in terms of enacting human rights legislation, okay? Over the last 5 years, the Pakistani government has also ratified numerous international conventions and treaties on human rights. Yet, at the same time, extrajudicial killings, sectarian and terrorist violence, the infamous blasphemy law, overall extremely poor governance, and bans on media continue to hamper Pakistan's polity. All right. I just want to talk about a couple of things. I do want to give the PPP government credit where it is due. It has managed to enact the 18th Amendment, part of which was preceded by the National Finance Commission award that increased the province's share of the fiscal budget from 47% to 57%, restored parliamentary sovereignty by deleting Article 58(2)(b) from the Constitution, has provided provincial autonomy by devolving powers to the provincial governments from the concurrent list. And so even though political parties have regained the lost space in constitutional matters, the military establishment still continues to dictate your foreign policy. All right. Extrajudicial killings and cases of missing persons in Balochistan continues to demonstrate the inability of the civilian government to control the military, intelligence agencies, and especially the frontier corps in the northwest of the country. Extraordinarily bad governance can also not be ignored. Heightened insecurity and increased terrorist attacks due to the inability or unwillingness to crack down on extremist elements demonstrates the lack of a clear strategy. The electoral alliances that political parties are making is also of extreme concern. I mean, Pakistan Muslim League being in cahoots with the Ahl Sunnat wal Jamaat, which is the renamed Sipai Sahaba organization, is highly problematic. What does that mean for the formation of government if PMLN were to win the election? So even though that space increased, all right, it has also simultaneously constricted because of all the other developments that have occurred. All right. I also want to talk about one last thing before I conclude, which is the reservation of seats for women in the parliament. All right. Now, that is quite a development, all right? It is quite a development because even though these women complain that they're seen as token or proxy women in parliament, and even though these women complain that they're not taken seriously because they do not have constituencies and are not directly elected, what these women have successfully managed to do, and I think most human rights activists around in Pakistan would agree, is that they've established a women's caucus in parliament. And that women's caucus cuts across party lines and has brought human rights legislation to the parliament. Okay, it is because of that we have seen the passage of the Domestic Violence Act, the Protection of Sexual Harassment of Women in the Workplace Act. Okay, these are significant strides, all right, and credit should be given where it's due. At the same time, however, these legislations have not been implemented. Okay, so we've increased the space for human rights considerably, but what about the implementation? All right, the government still lacks a plan for the implementation. So by way of a conclusion, I just want to say that the political party's rhetoric, at least in the coming days, all right, which is going to be a highly negative campaign strategy, all right, that is going to call into question how the Pakistan People's Party has not paid any attention to human rights, okay? And the fact that all political parties are cognizant of these human rights violations and are going to bring them to the forefront, all right? This very, very negative rhetoric during the campaign is going to get quickly diluted in the post-election context, and we need to remember that, all right? A space for HR human rights issues to be tackled through legislation has increased. Political parties are cognizant of this change, all right? It has little bearing on the strategy that they use in their day-to-day functioning, little bearing on the strategy that they're going to use to try and win the election. It has also become evident that merely enacting legislation, as many manifestos suggest, is not enough, all right? Holistic approaches to actually improving implementation is the need of the day. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out in such numbers. And I'm Saadia Toor, Associate Professor of Sociology at the College of Staten Island. Faina asked me to reintroduce myself, so that's why I'm doing it. Thank you to Farina and to the Pakistan Students Association and to the Center for South Asia Studies for holding this wonderful event and for inviting me. So what I want to talk about here touches on a lot of things that Mariam has already brought up and in some cases dealt with in greater depth than I will be dealing with. My concern was to basically zoom back a little bit and think about sort of more structural and long-term and historical issues and processes that sort of play into the problem of democratic transition. As Mariam said, we really are in a period of transition, and also the constraints and challenges that have faced Pakistan's democratic aspirations of the people of Pakistan from its very inception. So we're in the middle of Pakistan's first transfer of power between one elected civilian government and another, and that is, unfortunate as it sounds, quite a momentous occasion for Pakistan with all the caveats that Mariam has alerted us to. We have witnessed the first time an elected civilian government was able or allowed to complete its term, also very salutary. And so perhaps it's a good time to reflect on the issue of democracy and rights. And maybe in Q&A, I won't touch on this so much in my talk, but maybe in Q&A, we can talk specifically about what it means to talk about rights and what it means to talk about human rights, because I'm assuming maybe, Farina, that's why you wanted me to talk about the politics of human rights, but I don't really have time to go into that. But there is a particular way in which talking about citizenship and rights is very different from talking in the language of human rights. But that's a different discussion. So, of course, I want to sort of begin with a few statements, clarifications, which I'm sure are not news to many of you, but just so that we're all on the same page. So the fact that democracy, of course, is a process rather than a state, but also that democracy is as a mechanism through which to ensure the proper, by which one can mean equal and just representation of all citizens of a state, and that it too is a means to another end, the ability for all citizens of that state to lead a decent life, however that might be defined. Certainly, it should be a life that is free of the constant threat of violence from state and extra-state actors. Unfortunately, over its lifetime, Pakistan has become a state in which the strong, however defined, can act with impunity against the weak and the vulnerable, also however defined. And by that I mean in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of religious affiliation, in terms of ethnicity, right? This requires that we be attendant not just to the causes of this impunity, but also the relative strength and vulnerability of different groups and where that strength and vulnerability comes from, how it's managed and achieved. And also important to note that that all of this that we'll be talking about is not the result of some inevitable unfolding of a teleology that was set into motion because of something called the Pakistan movement or Pakistani nationalism as it was initially defined, but that it has had that it's a result of a series of contingencies and continuities and domestic and international factors. Some of these causes of this creation of weak groups and strong groups and the impunity of the strong are easier to see than others. For example, when it comes to minority communities, it's clear that non-Muslims and increasingly non-Sunnis are the targets of intense violence at the hands of non-state actors such as the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and others such as the erstwhile Sepah-Sabha by Pakistan, with the active or passive collusion of the state. And by the state, I mean both elected representatives and the military establishment. This violence can be traced directly back, of course, to the regressive legislation passed specifically under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and General Zia, which effectively rendered many of them second-class citizens, if not outright declared them homo sacer, as in communities and groups and populations against which any kind of violence can be allowed because they are not contained within the rhetoric of citizenship. It can also be traced back, of course, to the creation of sectarian Sunni groups like the SSP, of which the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi is an offshoot. These are by no means the only sectarian or militant religious groups operating in Pakistan, as we know. And their creation by military intelligence agencies and when we talk about this, we have to obviously talk about the context in which that happened, the role of Saudi Arabia and the Saudi Gulf, the Gulf oil states in sort of spreading a particular ideology and creating the financial assistance to enable that. Particularly in terms of their proxy war against Iran from the late 1970s onwards. And of course, the general culture of violence which became endemic in Pakistan during and after the Afghan War of the 1980s. And much of what I'm going to be saying about violence and applies obviously to minority communities as defined in Pakistan in religious terms, but also against women in terms of the legislation and the violence that extra-state actors enact. So episodic violence against these vulnerable groups and communities and individuals is only one type of violence, of course, experienced by them. There is also the structural violence of the everyday. In fact, for a vast majority, their vulnerability to both types of violence, the episodic violence and the everyday violence, is exacerbated by their economic and social status. So it's really important for us to pay attention to that economic and social status. So, for example, Christians' vulnerability in Pakistan is a product, obviously, of the kinds of legislation and the violence at the hands of extra-state actors, but also by their caste and class position in Pakistan, the relationship between them. And the same goes for Hindus, and in particular, when we're talking about class issues with regard to Hindu Pakistanis, we have to talk about issues of landlessness, because the majority of them are landless peasants in Sindh. And of course, the same goes for women in terms of economic insecurity and lack of financial independence. In order to understand how we got here, we have to understand the deeply anti-democratic nature of the classes that came to rule Pakistan immediately after independence, and the confluence between their domestic interests and the geopolitical interests of the U.S. in the Cold War era. I explore this obviously in detail in my book, but I'm going to touch about some of those themes here today. The brutal repression of democratic, leave alone left-wing struggles and demands, and especially the cynical way in which Islam was used to undermine the democratic aspirations of the majority of Pakistan's population, is a constant thread in our history, as is the role of the military establishment. And so, of course, the Cold War becomes an important context in which to understand the unfolding of a lot of processes that have led us to where we are today. The secession of East Pakistan following the West Pakistani establishment's refusal to accept the results of the 1971 election, and then a bloody military operation, had massive implications for what was left of Pakistan. East Pakistan had been an important countervailing force within Pakistani politics, and its loss laid the foundation for the complete takeover of the country by right-wing forces who were determined to reverse the limited gains of the democratic and left-wing struggles of the 1960s. Pakistan, under the military dictatorship of General Zia-ul Haq, became a society brutalized by state and extra-state violence, awash with drugs and guns, and with a vitiated legal system which, instead of protecting the vulnerable against the excesses of the majority, actually enabled violence against them. Right. So here, of course, we're talking about the fallout of the Afghan War of the 1980s. And it's important here to also remember that the early struggles of the anti-democratic forces in Pakistan and the ruling elite in Pakistan were struggles between secular forces. So both the ruling establishment and the left-wing and democratic forces that they were fighting can be considered secular forces. But that Islamist politics, rhetoric, organizations were given more and more space by the ruling establishment precisely as a way to undermine undermine leftists and left-wing politics. Over the 1990s, structural adjustment further eroded the social contract, creating new ranks of the vulnerable and swelling the old ones. Privatization, the hallmark of neoliberal policy, could be seen at work at all levels and spheres of society: economic, political, and social. And here, if we have time in the Q&A, we can talk about the role of NGOization, and also I would like to talk a little bit more about the role of the so-called independent commercial media in Pakistan. The 1990s saw, for example, increased state repression against the working class. Newly passed anti-terror laws were used against striking workers, even as privatization, downsizing, and the use of contract labor eroded even the limited rights of industrial and public sector workers. The same anti-terror laws are now being used against political dissidents and activists from all parts of Pakistan, but specifically the northern areas. And here I'm thinking in particular about Baba Jan and his fellow activists in Gilgit-Baltistan. The capacity of the state, as it had been, to provide social services and a limited safety net was reduced at the same time that major demographic changes in the rural and urban areas increased demands for social services. This allowed private entrepreneurs to step in to fill the vacuum. And so you have the development of criminal gangs and land and water mafias. The political instabilities of the 1990s, followed by military rule once again, along with the refusal and inability of the state to provide services and or ensure protection, enabled the entrenchment of not just these criminalized gangs and mafias, but the entrenchment of militant sectarian groups into the everyday lives of people in places as diverse as southern Punjab and the northern areas of Pakistan. Organizations such as the SSP and now most recently the TTP have developed strong links with the local land and water mafias in rural, peri-urban and urban areas of Pakistan. And here we can think about the recent assassination of the OPP activist Parveen Rahman and the responsibility for that, which lies with the land mafia in Karachi, but deeply embedded with the TTP in Karachi as well. At the same time, the privatization of other aspects of social and political life have also had severe consequences for the democratic aspirations of the Pakistani people. And so we can think about various ways in which this has happened in the last 20-odd years. We can think about education, and I'm thinking not just in terms of private and public education at the primary and middle school levels, which of course are part of exacerbating class divisions and creating the kind of inequality that we're seeing or have been seeing in Pakistan since the 1990s. I'm also talking about the ways in which the privatization of higher education has actually led to the corrosion of a sense of a public sphere and the sense of a public even in Pakistan. Because whereas earlier these nationalized institutions of higher learning used to be places which brought together a diverse cross-section of Pakistanis from across the country, across provinces, you no longer see that kind of diversity in class and regional and ethnic terms. So now you have elite institutions, and you have the institutions like the Punjab University and Karachi University, which are still very much sort of hostage to the kinds of professionalized, violent student politics that also sort of developed in the 1980s and 1990s. And we talk about health, you can talk about how the privatization of health has also exacerbated class divides. And then taking a cue from Arif Hassan, the important ways in which public life has also been privatized in Pakistan, such that the elite are now completely cut off in very real ways from the vast majority of Pakistanis. And of course, that class divide was always there, but there were ways in which public spaces such as museums and zoos and other forms of entertainment brought together a cross-section of people. And as Arif Hassan has very fabulously documented, since the 1980s, what you've seen is a retreat of the elite from these public spaces and their privatization of themselves behind gated communities, residentially, but also in terms of entertainment, in terms of every aspect of public life. And those of us who have lived in Pakistan or visited Pakistan can see this very viscerally and very clearly. And there are ways in which NGOization has exacerbated all of these problems. So Pakistan today, I've argued, is an exemplary neoliberal security state. And perhaps I should add that it's a neoliberal frontline security state, which kind of highlights the makes the security aspect of it sort of even more important to look at. So a neoliberal security state is one whose repressive aspects are strengthened at the same time as its role as a provider of social services and social welfare is reduced or eviscerated through privatization. Neoliberalism, with its unsustainable levels of inequality, comes to require a security state to protect the interests of the ruling classes, which basically means its strengthening of the repressive apparatus of the state. It must be noted that in Pakistan, this process began under one Afghan war and has unfolded in the shadow of the current one. Balochistan exemplifies the contradictions of this militarized neoliberal state. Its economic and political marginalization is underscored by its geostrategic and economic importance. The current war has enabled the exploitation and repression, further exploitation and repression of the people of Balochistan. Under Pervez Musharraf, Balochistan became the focus of lucrative development projects through extractive industries and the construction of a port at Gwadar, while a repressive military operation was unleashed against the legitimate uprising of the Baloch. Thousands of Baloch activists have been disappeared in the past 10 odd years, with their tortured bodies dumped in the open, often as a lesson to others. Again, under the cover of the war on terror, the Pakistani military establishment has sought to undermine the secular nationalism of Baloch uprisings through religious militants. The recent attack on the Hazara community in Quetta by the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi has to be seen as part and parcel of this move. In fact, the use of violence by state and extra-state forces is a major threat to democracy and human rights in Pakistan. And this, of course, includes the drone attacks and various military operations that we've been seeing for the last 8 or 10 years. And given the relationship between these forms of violence and the continuing power of the military establishment with the wars in Afghanistan, it stands to reason that democracy in Pakistan cannot survive, leave alone thrive, without an end to that war. And here I'm not arguing that ending the war is a sufficient condition for democracy to be restored, but that it is a necessary condition for any type of democratization of Pakistan's polity and society. The democratic transition that Pakistan is going through is important, but the inability or unwillingness of the PPP government at the national level and the PMLN at the provincial level to curtail the violence against minorities or provide them protection speak to difficult and deeply entrenched problems that will not dissipate over time simply through repeated elections. What we need, of course, are strong forces that can pressure political parties from below. And of course, there's always role for pressure from above, from people's movements outside of of Pakistan, as long as they are committed to actual restoration of democracy or strengthening of democracy, and not sort of democracy as a cover for other kinds of geostrategic interests, as we've often seen. So, what I would argue is that, of course, we need strong social movements from below. And in fact, those are the most important and most, promising forces of democratization in Pakistan today as well. Everything from the million-strong Anjuman Mazarine of Punjab, which has held its own against a military establishment for the past 10 years. It is really quite unbelievable that landless peasants have been able to basically hold back the military in the way that they have. The role that women have played in that movement, the fact of a movement that has both Christian and Muslim peasants, despite efforts to split them along religious lines, has also, I think, has immense lessons for us. We're seeing movements like this now crop up in the absence of political parties that are willing to take up people's actual issues, crop up over land rights issues and water rights issues in various parts of Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the Punjab. And it is to these forces, I think, and these movements that we really must look for any hope for a deep democratization of Pakistan. Thanks.
What we'd like to do is open it up to Q&A. You can direct your questions to either Saadia. You can direct your questions to either of the speakers or both of them. The floor is open. While we're working on the mics, the floor can still be open, and we can. Hello. I suspect we all know how to actually speak to the whole room. Yes. Does anyone have a question? Iman, in the back.
Thank you. Well, I can also talk louder, I guess, if it doesn't work. But thanks for the talk, both of you. I thought it was fascinating. The question I have is for Saadia. When you talk about pressure coming from the bottom on these political parties, but at the same time we're looking at what Mariam says is a centralized structure of political parties where there's little space for political workers to actually influence either who gets the party ticket or what comes on the agenda. And if the calculus is just to win the elections and not the policy agenda, then that's kind of a disconnect. So you gave one example, but what is the strategy that has worked there in bridging that gap?
I mean, that's a really tough question, obviously, because what I am talking about, obviously, are very long-term processes, and they require, and they're very complicated processes that feed into one another. So in ways in which it's not always easy to say, well, first we must do this, and then this will happen, and then this will lead to this, right? There's so many things that are happening always at the same time that, I mean, and I feel like my interest usually, even though of course as a Pakistani, I'm very interested in actual everyday ways in which political parties function. But as a scholar, my interest always has been towards the longer term structures and processes. And I think the only hope that we have of any kind of structural change, and as I think Mariam was also pointing out in indirect ways, is that so you have political parties. They have their own, ways of functioning. They have their own clientelism. They have their own limited sort of calculus of how to win elections. Well, how is it that you can change that? Well, the only way to change that, I mean, the Supreme Court of Pakistan is not going to change that, right? So how is it that we can actually force them to change that? Because huge demographic changes have taken place in Pakistan that are absolutely not reflected in the ways in which political parties function. And so their shortcut has been to just ignore what people want and to focus on the local power brokers. And that's where actually these really dangerous alliances with these sectarian groups like the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and the SSP, now AWSJ, come about, is because they're only looking at how it is that they can win this election. And the only way you can really change that is through this longer, more convoluted, much more complex process of democratization of a society. And we have to keep remembering that the problems that we're facing right now are not problems that were created overnight. This is a systematic, project by which, with its own contradictions and its own sort of ways in which it was overcome briefly or challenged briefly, but almost 70 years of a process in which every democratic force in society was horribly crushed, brutally crushed, continues to be. So in that kind of a context, I think the only option we have is to democratize at a deep level as well, in terms of how people think, how it is that they feel they can hold people accountable. And the power of, 1 million strong on the roads is still something that political parties, I think, feel they cannot ignore. Right? So how is it that we have to basically figure out how it is that we can channel the aspirations of people, on the ground and force this kind of structural change.
Aisha, would you mind waiting for the microphone? Shari, can you give me the mic?
My question is to Mariam, and I could ask questions of Saadia as well, but it's not even. All right. My question is regarding your description of the Pakistani political system, of how it works electorally. And of course, we are aware of that local influentials decide which party is winning and then apply for tickets. But how is this different, let's say, from India? I understand that there are certain constituencies in India too where the strength of the political party is enough for Congress or the BJP to hold. But the rest of it is constituency politics. So could you explain how India is different, which clearly has a stronger political party system?
Right. I mean, I think one aspect of the difference is also what happens in the post-election scenario, all right, in India, where once these individuals come to power, all right, the way the electoral process then works, or the way the formation of the government occurs, is slightly different, and it has been bolstered by the dominance of the civilian institutions over the military institutions. That's one difference, but it's a slightly cop out of an answer, actually. I think more integrally, what I have observed in Pakistan is that a lot of the local influence of these power brokers, the one resource that these power brokers seem to have in common was land. and very, very large land holdings. Now, that has also significantly changed. As Saadia just mentioned, there are huge demographic changes and huge ways in which land has been parceled out in Pakistan. However, the failure of the land reforms that were carried out in the 60s and then subsequently in the 1970s under the PPP government, to a certain extent has allowed these power brokers to retain their political influence through the politics of controlling this land, all right? So regardless of which dispensation comes to power, whether it's a military dispensation or a civilian dispensation, these individuals manage to make themselves indispensable as the liaison between the state and the citizen, all right? Now, in India, I haven't studied India as carefully as I studied Pakistan, so I cannot speak to specific constituencies. But the back of many of the landed elite in India was broken because of the successful land reforms. And if you go further back into history, and this is Gil Martin's thesis, not so much mine, but if you go further back into history and read some of the work that David Gil Martin did on the British colonization of Pakistan and how that differed from the policies that were carried out in India, there is something to be said, I think, okay, about how creating this class of rural elite that has then perpetuated itself over time, thanks also to the interruptions in Pakistan's electoral process, have made themselves indispensable. I mean, these are some of the differences that.
But I mean, caste has been a very, very important factor in India,
It
despite
has.
land reforms. If you look at the UP elections, if you look at how the BJP was able to win, on the face of it, everybody thought it was ideology. In fact, political scientists, including Zoya Hassan, have shown very carefully that it was constituency manipulation. So caste. So my point is that ultimately it actually is really a question of the nature of the state. I mean, in the case of Pakistan, it's a military-dominated state, and so there are interruptions, and that's basically what's wrong. But otherwise, what you're describing is not substantially, it would seem, different. Local influentials do matter. And I mean, if you look at the entire thrust of the Indian polity, where regional parties are becoming more dominant, I think it would suggest a similar sort of scenario. So I would say that the real clue lies in the nature of the state. That needs to be examined more fully, or why this happens in Pakistan and not so much in India.
Sure. Yes, you had a question here in the front. Yes.
My name is Amjad Hussain. I'm a newspaperman from Toledo, Ohio.
Doctor.
That was my other life. I was intrigued by your mention of violence, and you categorized that as episodic and also a continuous. I am still at a loss to find a common denominator in Pakistan of violence as to, unless there are 5 or 6 or 7 different outfits on a separate trajectory causing this violence, we need to be able to find a common denominator as to what that is. And I just have not been able to find that. I wonder if you will address that.
Are you talking about the episodic violence?
I'm talking about violence, period, as to what is it which is driving people towards that convergence point, a state convergence point, whether it is the ethnic, whether it is religious, whether it is class warfare, whatever that is. I want to know in a very simple terms as to really what is perpetuating that and what is the impact.
That's the simple terms. I'm not sure that there's an answer to your question that's that simple, and I'm not even sure that there is a common denominator, except, I mean, and also it depends on who the agents of this violence are in your argument. I mean, are we talking about organizations such as the sectarian and jihadi outfits? Are we talking about mob violence, which, as we know, is not generally spontaneous?
Let me rephrase it. Is there all kind of violence which is being committed in Pakistan is every group will have some kind of a motive to do that. I am looking for a common denominator between them, whether they know it or not, to see what is the end point for that. And I'm not talking about the petty violence. I'm talking about organized violence.
Because violence produces results. It's cheap and it produces results. And not everybody has access to violence or violent means, and not everybody is allowed to get away with using those violent means. So I think if there is a common denominator that we're looking for, it really is the military establishment, if you will, that has created over time a tolerance. I mean, it tolerates violence from certain groups and certain spaces and certain places that has sort of infiltrated all aspects of life in Pakistan. And I think that, in conjunction with the long periods of authoritarian military or civilian rule, those create very potent foundations for the use of violence. That, in addition to the fact that that violence is tolerated by the state, right? Because they have relationships with the state. By the state, you can talk about the civilian government, the political parties, and so on, or you can talk about the military establishment and the intelligence agencies. So either they have those direct dealings and relationships, or because it serves the class interests of those in power to allow certain kinds of violence to remain endemic in Pakistan.
I thought both of these talks were great, and it's a great start to hopefully a really good day of discussion. My question to you is to you, Saadia, though. You briefly mentioned NGOs, and I wondered if you might come back to that and just, I mean, for those of us in the audience who aren't experts on Pakistan, maybe give us a sort of structural overview of, I think we have a pretty good framework now to think about the organization of politics in the country. How do NGOs inflect that?
Well, I think NGOs have played a mixed role in Pakistan. And of course, that also depends on whether you're talking about human rights NGOs or you're talking about sort of more social welfare-oriented NGOs. But in both cases, and I've sort of made this case in more detail in my book, there are ways in which the NGOization of Pakistan has been part and parcel of the neoliberalization of Pakistan, right? So, and I tend to think of NGOs within the public sphere, particularly human rights and civil rights NGOs, as being part of a privatized sphere of politics, if you will, right? So, and then if we're talking about the social welfare NGOs, there have been ways in which they have enabled the neoliberalization of the state by taking over the functions that the state just retreated from, right? So of course you can argue, well, somebody had to take over, but I'm not holding them culpable. I'm making a structural argument about how these factors have then come together to shape a particular kind of landscape within which certain kinds of politics have play and certain kinds of politics do not. And so, for example, because of the fact that we've had a military dictatorship for so long, and that even in the 1990s we had this punctuated democracy, always with the military establishment in the background, there are ways in which NGOs came to sort of occupy the space that politicians or a national, vibrant political democratic framework would have done, right? And these are not roles that they are really designed to play. And of course, they could also, I think, even in their limited sphere of influence, have done much more in terms of democratizing society than I feel that they did. And that, of course, ties into particular cycles of donor funding and particular cycles that are limited to projects, as opposed to building, deep, long commitments to communities and working with communities towards transformation. There have been NGOs that have done that, right? And there are ways in which even these self-help organizations that have done fabulous work, such as community-based organizations, also can be depoliticizing in some ways. Not always, But I think the overall effect has been, while there is always this rhetoric of human rights, there has been a way in which they've enabled a depoliticization as well.
My question is for Mariam. I wonder if you could talk about the notion of democratic transitions. Because in your talk you talked about the lack of structuralization of political parties as being a potential problem, in terms of their effective functioning, be it in terms of creating new legislation for human rights or implementation of it. I wonder what is this state of transition, and why is it that the political system in Pakistan is always framed in those terms, as if it's meant to transition to something? What is that state? Or could we look at the political system in other ways where it is seen as a state in itself and not something that is supposed to achieve a state of completion?
I mean, one of the overarching things that I would argue over here is that, yes, it isn't a state unto itself, all right? Which is why I say that when we think about Pakistan, we constantly keep saying that Pakistan is a state of democratic transition, or Pakistan is in a state of, it's always a state of transition to something, whether it's a transition to more authoritarianism or whether it's a transition to more democracy, all right? And the problem with this kind of discourse, or the problem with using these kinds of terms is exactly this. Essentially, you're talking about thresholds, okay? And political scientists have this way of saying, well, if such and such characteristics are met, then the country can successfully be called a democracy. And then there are types of democracy, okay? And so there are these descriptive terms that are then attached to this word democracy, right? So you have a procedural democracy, you have a substantive democracy, you have a liberal democracy. I mean, you can just go on with a list of adjectives that are used to explain each and every one of these different states that you're talking about. And I'm saying that one of the mistakes that I think political scientists have primarily made is that they look at this hybrid regime type, all right, where there is both authoritarian and democratic tendencies, and they view this state as an incomplete or a corrupted form of democracy. All right, it is not an incompletion, it's not a corruption, it is a state unto itself, it is the hybrid state, all right? And we need to start rethinking how we actually understand what this hybrid state is. And one of the attempts that I have tried to make, at least in my broader work, is to explain how power is distributed across a hybrid polity, all right? And the way I do that is by examining these recruitment and selection practices, which I didn't do too much of in this presentation, but that's where my broader work goes. One of the things that I would also propose that political scientists need to start doing is to start thinking of hybridity not as a static state. It's not a static state. It is actually a dynamic state, all right? And it's constantly changing, all right? And that's why I say that if we think of hybridity as a combination of authoritarian and democratic tendencies, and see that these tendencies tend to fluctuate, all right, that would explain the situation in countries like Pakistan a little bit better, all right? Countries that seem to be locked into the state of hybridity, all right, because these punctuated democratic interregnums, or because they do not seem to cross this threshold of what we would term democracy, we need to actually start thinking of this persistence of hybridity and why exactly it persists. And I think it goes back to what Aisha's comment on my presentation to a certain extent was, that you need to actually start thinking about the nature of the state as well. And I think preceding the nature of the state, you also have to understand exactly how power is distributed, which is what I try to do in my broader work. And I agree. I mean, the nature of the state is definitely something that comes into this, because that is what will explain a lot of the comparative questions that would emerge from a research agenda such as this.
Eric in the back.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, as Farina will tell you, I'm studying Egypt, and of course at this point there's a lot of parallels. And so I wanted to suggest, and maybe to bring the conversation back to the point you want to talk about human rights versus citizenship rights, and how, and to suggest that you called Pakistan over the course of the past 30 years of dictatorship turning into a exemplary neoliberal security state, and that in this transition to contested elections, that there's actually no contradiction in a security state with free elections. And in the process of deciding or learning what to call this new kind of Pakistani state, how can we perhaps look at the relationship of elected actors to security law and the military? I think before we tended to look at it as a kind of antagonistic relationship, but now, you know, after 2008 and 2013, should we look at, you know, or wonder about elected officials becoming comfortable working with the non-elected institutions of the state the way that they do in other security states? Not to be overly dramatic, but, you know, like the relationship elected officials in the United States have to the security state institutions in this very country. So.
Did you want to talk? No, I completely agree with you. And I mean, there's a way in which they have to work with the military establishment. There may be contradictions, and there may be ways, as with the persona of Nawaz Sharif, where those, you know, contradictions are manifested in individuals and his long-standing sort of fight with Musharraf and therefore the military. But it's simply not possible, I think, in Pakistan for elected officials to function without some kind of working relationship with the military. And that, you know, just speaks to how deeply embedded the military is in the polity of the country, despite the fact that you've had these very important anti-military movements, which has, you know, forced it to retreat from formal politics. But of course, the fact of, you know, and I think this is where we have to constantly go back to this long history of the entrenchment of the military in Pakistan and the role that Pakistan as a frontline state has played into that, into sort of upholding it, into feeding it, and that, you know, and that's what we're seeing even today.
Could I follow up on that one? You mentioned about the military being entrenched. I wondered if you could comment on that in context to what happened in South America as well as in Turkey, the transition from the military dictatorships to a civilian democratic. I mean, what did it take in those countries to do that, and why can't it be done in Pakistan, or can it be done in Pakistan?
You're the comparativist.
I mean, what's also interesting about the military state in Pakistan is how it differs from the typical military juntas of South America. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have? Okay. You know, the military juntas of South America and the way the military actually took on the reformist agenda in Turkey. I mean, these military states are considerably different. Different from the Pakistani military state, in that the Pakistani military state was not as repressive as the repression of the South American military states. All right. Now, of course, repression is a subjective term. All right, and we can go into lots of further debate about that. But if you look at the consensus, at least in the political science literature that I've read, especially again scholars like O'Donnell and Schmitter, who are the big names in the transitions literature, at least. I mean, the way they talk about the South American military regime is about how it has entrenched itself in politics, not necessarily by having elected parliaments. All right. I mean, one of the things that the military in Pakistan always tries to do, in order to perpetuate itself in power, while also maintain this legitimacy of having some kind of an elected, front. All right, is to have this parliament in place. All right, and that's one of the reasons I think these constituency politicians that I'm talking about actually become reasonably significant. All right. So, I mean, I think those differences need to be teased out. But of course, you have to go into like the details of like how exactly the military perpetuated itself in power in South America and how that differed from the way it did so in Pakistan.
I mean, I'm supposed to make comments at the end of the session, and I have a lot to say, and I'm not sure whether you want me to do it at the end or you want me to respond as things come, you know, because this is a major question that's been asked both by somebody who's doing Egypt and now with South America. And I have things to say.
Then certainly you should take this opportunity.
First of all, I'd like to say that it's a great mistake to assume that I mean, there has been military dominance, but Pakistan has also been a country with several democratic springs, which is unlike Egypt. Pakistan has never had a 30 to 40-year rule by one individual. That speaks volumes about the vibrancy of the society. It speaks about the resistance that is inherent in the culture, which can be attributed to an anti-colonial nationalism. And all of that, I think, is extremely important to place on the table right here. How is Pakistan different from South American regimes? I think it's very interesting not just to see the difference, but how South American regimes in the recent years have had to go back into politics. Why have they done so? They've done so for their own purposes. The first principle to understand is the military comes into power for its own interests. It goes out of power for its own interests. The reason why there is a democratic moment in Pakistan, however problematic, however threatened by violence and corruption and whatever you want to put there, is the fact that the military is in trouble. The Pakistani military is deeply in trouble, just as the way the Brazilian military was, which is why the Brazilian military moved out of politics. And the reason is that there have been, first of all, there's an ideological conflict in the military. We have seen attacks taking place where there's the Mehran base in Karachi, where you see that there is an inside job, there is a connection between those who are pro-Taliban, who are against the policies that were adopted in 2001. So I think that is the reason why there is a moment, a democratic opportunity for Pakistan. But I will elaborate on this later. If the politicians don't get it right, it's about time we stop blaming the military, or for that matter, even the politicians. You know, people need to get on the band and do the things right. And I have lots to say about that.
Okay. We'll look forward to that. I would actually like to take my prerogative as the chair to ask each of our speakers to reflect, if they would, on just one thing, which is that having a conference on human rights and Pakistan doesn't leave much room for optimism, and yet we are going into the first democratic transition in Pakistan's history. And I was wondering if both of you would just take a moment to reflect on what do you think that means, particularly in a context where, Saadia, you have talked about longer structures which make change, you know, a kind of watershed moment, you know, is perhaps not something we can anticipate. We cannot anticipate dramatic change out of this. And Mariam, you too reflected in your comments about a kind of a cynical politics at play, which also doesn't suggest an immediate prospects for radical change. So I just thought if you guys would take a moment to reflect on why this is such a significant moment for both of you as scholars of Pakistan.
I mean, some of the things that I mentioned right at the start of the presentation, right, that I think are optimistic, all right? Opening up the electoral process to Fatah, I think that is optimistic, all right? I mean, that was long overdue, all right? And it's happened only in 2010, all right? That is optimistic. The fact that Nadra was called in at huge costs to try and fix the electoral roll, and the Election Commission of Pakistan being committed to actually having somewhat of an accurate electoral roll going into the next election, that is optimistic. I think that's a big stride, actually, for the Pakistani electoral process. So, I mean, these would be some reasons for optimism. I think the Election Commission of Pakistan is being overactive. I think it's being hyper-activist right now in the way that it is carrying out its duties and carrying out the program, the strategic 5-year program that it's laid out for itself. But at the same time, at least they're doing something, right? And just as Aisha just mentioned right now, I mean, there are lots of things that we need to start doing right. And if this is one way of starting to do that something right, then there is hope. The other thing that I see as being optimistic, and this is a little bit more long-term than short-term, is that when you do have an electoral process, okay, political parties over time, because of an uninterrupted electoral process, will have to renegotiate this very cynical recruitment and selection tactics that I laid out for you. One of the ways I see that happening, I mean, just to give you a very, very quick example, and I've been thinking a lot about this. So political parties have gone ahead and made electoral alliances, right? But Pakistan People's Party has merged with Pakistan Muslim League Q, all right? Candidate selection became very, very difficult for both these political parties with an electoral alliance and the hope of forming a government that would be a coalition, all right? Where did this exactly happen? In NA 105 in Gujarat, all right, from where Pervez Ulahi wants to contest the election, and Chaudhry Ahmad Mukhtar, who is our erstwhile water and power minister and our ex-defense minister, wants to contest the government as well. Now, these political parties are hard-pressed to please both candidates, all right, which basically means that over time, political parties will be forced to look for people who are not necessarily tied to their constituencies only because it happens to be their home base, all right? And that will lead to a situation, an a first past the post situation, like in Canada, like in Britain, where political parties not only determine who the candidates are going to be, but where those candidates are actually going to contest from, okay? I mean, that is something that we can hope for, all right? Along with all the mistakes that we are making, I mean, there's some things that will fall into place.
Saadia, final word of the panel?
Well, I mean, I completely agree. I think with all its problems and with all the constraints and challenges, one thing is clear, that you can't not have a decently long period of electoral politics and democratically elected governments, that concede power at the end of their mandated time to an electoral process, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is part of a broader democratic, change in society. And what elections do also is that they open up public discourse to conversations, despite what might happen at the top level of political parties in terms of negotiations of seats and all of that and candidates. I mean, it does open up the political and public sphere across the board to conversations that you cannot have when there isn't this kind of a democratic process happening. And now, you're seeing sort of a multiplicity of political actors also taking part in these elections, not necessarily because they feel that they have the strength to win at a national level or a regional level, but because, again, electioneering and this kind of lead up to elections allows you to insert your ideas and challenge existing ideas. So, for example, the Awami Workers' Party, which is the new left-wing party which has emerged from the merger of several smaller left-wing parties, the Labour Party of Pakistan and etc. I mean, they are very heavily into the campaigning game. I mean, they do want to win local level elections as well, but also because they see it, like all left-wing parties see this as a moment to sort of change the discourse or push the discourse of democracy in a different direction.
Great. Thank you. We'll conclude this panel now, and the next panel will be at 1:30. Thanks.